I remember walking into the sleek, sunlit lawyer's office in Ithaca, New York, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn air. Ryan, my husband, was already seated across the mahogany table, a calm, confident smile stretching across his face. In front of him lay a thick stack of papers, the transfer agreement that would temporarily hand over controlling interest of Whitman Ridge Estate, the vineyard my father had built from nothing, to a holding company he managed. He spoke with the kind of practiced ease that made danger sound like reassurance. "It's just a temporary restructuring to protect the business," he said smoothly, his lawyer nodding beside him. My pen hovered over the top sheet, and I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in the quiet room. I signed, right there, under the office lights, in front of witnesses, trusting a man whose eyes seemed to hold all the answers. He believed he had planned every move flawlessly, every loophole accounted for, but he didn't know about the DNA test results I had sent off 2 weeks earlier. One envelope, one piece of paper, could turn the entire game around. The moment I realized that signing wasn't just a gesture, it was a trap, I left the office, trying to steady my shaking hands, and drove back to the estate. The familiar rows of Riesling and ice wine vines blurring past in the morning light. Whitman Ridge had been in my family for 3 generations. And it was more than just land, it was proof of decades of sweat, care, and love. Every vine held a memory. Every barrel carried the weight of my father's labor. I had inherited more than a business. I had inherited responsibility. At 32, I thought I understood responsibility. I had remarried, believing I had found a partner who appreciated the legacy and would help protect it. But the papers I had just signed gave Ryan temporary control, and a gnawing suspicion began to form in the pit of my stomach. Something about his calm demeanor felt off. His charm and reassurance were masks, and I had no guarantee that the vineyard I loved wouldn't be leveraged or exploited. Back at home, I placed the envelope with the DNA test results on the passenger seat of my car and stared at it, unwilling to open it just yet. The test had been sent quietly, in secret, because I needed to know the truth about the family, about Ryan, about who might have a claim to this land. I knew the results could upend everything, and I wasn't ready to confront that reality just yet. Instead, I focused on the routine tasks of the estate. But every grape, every barrel, every smell of fermentation reminded me of what was at stake. Later that afternoon, I retrieved my laptop and finally clicked open the email containing the DNA results. My fingers trembled as I scrolled, heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't predict what I would find, but I knew this moment could change everything. My father's legacy, the vineyard, the family name, all of it hung on what that envelope held. Ryan had thought he controlled the narrative, but one simple revelation could unravel all of his careful planning. I remembered the countless afternoons spent in the crush room with my father as a teenager. Sticky hands from grape juice, his laughter echoing off the cellar walls. He had always said, "Claire, this land isn't just soil, it's a story. Protect it with everything you have." Those words had always resonated. But now, as I faced the reality of Ryan's plans, they felt like a warning I had been too naive to heed. The sun began to dip lower over the Finger Lakes, casting long shadows across the vineyard. I stood by the edge of the property, the scent of crushed grapes and oak filling the cool evening air. One signature, one day, one envelope, it all had the power to change everything. I had to be careful. I had to be patient. And I had to understand that reclaiming control wasn't about confrontation or anger. It was about strategy, awareness, and vigilance. I finally picked up the envelope containing the DNA results, feeling its weight in my hands. The vineyard stretched before me, rows of vines bathed in the fading light, whispering reminders of the legacy I was sworn to protect. My life, my inheritance, and the family name rested on the decisions I would make in the days ahead. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I might discover. One envelope could change everything, and I was ready to find out what secrets it held. After the adrenaline of the lawyer's office and the tension from the unopened DNA envelope, I returned to Whitman Ridge Estate, trying to ground myself in the familiar sense of crushed grapes and oak barrels. The morning sunlight glinted across the frost-kissed rows of Riesling and ice wine vines, their orderly pattern a quiet reminder of decades of careful cultivation. Everything about the estate, the land, the barrels, the labels, carried my father's legacy. Losing control of it, even temporarily, felt like a betrayal of all he had worked for. I walked through the winery, touching the familiar surfaces, remembering the countless hours I had spent learning the business from him. Flashbacks rose unbidden. Crouching in the crush room at 14, my hands sticky with juice. Thomas Whitman's laughter filling the air as he guided my work. Those moments were etched in my memory. A constant reminder that Whitman Ridge wasn't just property, it was a testament to diligence, patience, and pride. My mother had passed away early, leaving only my father and me to carry the family name. He always said, "Claire, this land isn't just soil, it's a story. Protect it with everything you have." Returning to the present, I realized how fragile my inheritance had become. Ryan's smooth assurances and careful charm had led me to sign documents that granted him temporary control. But the DNA test waiting on my desk represented a shift in leverage I hadn't yet fully understood. The estate's history, my father's intent, and the family name all rested on decisions that now felt perilous. I contacted Mr. Halpern, the estate's accountant who had worked closely with my father for decades. His expression was grim as I laid out the situation, the signed transfer documents, Ryan's confidential emails with investors, and the financial arrangements I had just uncovered. "Claire," he said cautiously, "Ryan's arrangements could violate bank covenants and potentially trigger intervention from the lenders. This isn't just a risk to control, it's a risk to the entire estate." I absorbed his words in silence, staring out at the rows of vines. The vineyard had survived decades of frost, drought, and market pressures, but now it faced a threat I hadn't anticipated: deception from the person I trusted most. The weight of responsibility settled over me like a physical presence, pressing against my chest. Whitman Ridge was more than a family business. It was proof of my father's life and vision. I could not let it slip away. Later that day, a manila envelope arrived from a law firm in Vermont. Inside were documents and inquiries regarding a man named Daniel Whitman, who, according to preliminary information, might be my father's son from a previous relationship. My heart thudded as I read through the papers. Daniel had lived quietly, unaware of any claim to the estate. But the legal implications were immediate. If his claim were recognized, the temporary control Ryan had secured could be challenged, and my signed documents might be rendered vulnerable. The revelation sent a jolt of clarity through me. Ryan had assumed he controlled the narrative completely, but the appearance of Daniel introduced a factor he had never accounted for. I realized that strategy, patience, and evidence were more critical than emotion. Daniel wasn't a threat. He was a key to protecting what had always been mine. I spent the afternoon reviewing the Vermont documents, cross-referencing them with my father's will and financial records. Every detail mattered: dates, signatures, and correspondence that could corroborate Daniel's claim. I recognized that this was more than just a legal challenge. It was a test of vigilance and foresight. The stakes had grown higher than I could have imagined. As evening fell, I wandered among the rows of vines, the autumn sunlight painting everything in gold. I thought about my father's lessons and the years I had spent learning every nuance of the estate. The vineyard seemed alive with memory, whispering warnings and encouragement in equal measure. Ryan's overconfidence and secret maneuvers had placed him in a precarious position, and with Daniel's potential involvement, the balance of power could shift dramatically. I set the Vermont envelope carefully on my desk, my fingers lingering on its edges. The DNA results waiting in the other envelope felt heavier now, loaded with implications I couldn't yet predict. Whitman Ridge Estate was no longer just a vineyard. It was a puzzle of legacy, legality, and loyalty. Every decision in the coming days would be critical. As night fell, I sat by the tasting room window, gazing at the illuminated rows of vines under the moonlight. One envelope, one revelation, and one careful strategy could secure the estate. I knew I needed to plan meticulously, gather every piece of evidence, and prepare for the unexpected. The stakes were higher than ever, and Whitman Ridge, and everything my father had built, rested in my hands. I picked up the envelope with the DNA test results, my pulse quickening. The moment I opened it, I knew the course of the estate, my inheritance, and the family legacy would never be the same. I watched Ryan move through the estate with his usual confidence, giving instructions to the harvest crew, reviewing spreadsheets, and speaking in his calm, persuasive tone. But something about the way he glanced at my office door made my stomach tighten. I had begun to notice cracks in his carefully crafted facade, the hurried phone calls he took outside, the subtle tension in his posture, the way his smile seemed just a fraction too forced. He thought he controlled every angle, but I could feel the shift in power, even if he hadn't noticed it yet. That afternoon, I called Mr. Halpern, the accountant who had worked with my father for decades. His voice was low and serious as he outlined the hidden risks Ryan had created. "Claire," he said, "the Vermont startup he's been funneling money into isn't just a small project. The estate is tied up in collateral you didn't approve. If anything goes wrong, the bank could intervene directly." My heart sank as I absorbed his words. Ryan's temporary control was more than a formality, it was leverage. And he had positioned himself to benefit from mistakes I hadn't even realized existed. But the revelation of Daniel's potential claim added an unpredictable variable. If Daniel's legal status were verified, Ryan's entire plan could unravel. By evening, I had a plan forming. I would confront Ryan, but carefully, without giving away the full extent of what I knew. I waited until the vineyard was quiet, the crew gone, the golden sunset casting long shadows across the rows of Riesling and ice wine vines. I found him in the main office, studying the latest investor emails. "Ryan," I said, keeping my voice calm, "we need to discuss all financial arrangements related to the estate. No omissions. No shortcuts." He looked up, his confident smile in place. "Claire, you're overthinking. Everything is under control," he said smoothly. But for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of unease. I pushed further, laying out some of the emails I had uncovered, carefully choosing which details to reveal. His composure wavered for a split second. Then he recovered, deflecting blame to market pressures and investor demands, insisting I didn't understand the complexity of managing a growing estate. That confrontation confirmed what I had feared and suspected. Ryan had underestimated me, and he had built a house of cards that could collapse under scrutiny. Every interaction, every hidden email, every ledger discrepancy became a tool in my hands. I understood that protecting Whitman Ridge would require patience, strategy, and precision. Daniel's potential involvement was the key that could tip the balance in our favor. I spent the night walking through the estate, the rows of vines stretching endlessly under the silver light of the moon. The familiar sense of crushed grapes and oak filled the air, but they couldn't mask the weight pressing down on me. I thought about my father's lessons: diligence, vigilance, and understanding the people around me. Every barrel, every label, every vine represented decades of work, a testament to integrity and care. I could not let Ryan's manipulation destroy that. A small note slipped under the door caught my attention. The handwriting was unfamiliar, deliberate. "Meet me at the old Whitman barn at dawn. We need a plan." My pulse quickened. Daniel's involvement was no longer hypothetical. He was stepping into the story, and his insight could help me expose Ryan's deceptions. I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The balance of power was shifting. But the stakes had never been higher. I prepared my documents meticulously that night. The signed transfer papers, the emails to Vermont investors, and the financial records that revealed Ryan's hidden arrangements. Each piece of evidence could be used strategically, but only if I approached the situation carefully. One wrong move could undo everything. Giving Ryan an advantage I could not afford to grant. As dawn approached, I finally allowed myself a moment to breathe. The vineyard was silent, save for the rustle of leaves in the early morning breeze. Ryan's overconfidence had blinded him to the reality that Daniel and I now shared knowledge he couldn't anticipate. The estate, my inheritance, and my father's legacy were in play, and I had begun to understand the game I was in. When the first light of morning touched the barrels and vines, I knew the day ahead would be decisive. Daniel's guidance, the DNA revelation, and the evidence I had gathered were all tools I would need to navigate this high-stakes battle. Whitman Ridge was no longer just a vineyard, it was a battlefield. And I was ready to take my first moves in the strategy that could secure everything my family had built. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of my office at Whitman Ridge Estate as I finally opened the envelope containing the DNA test results. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the papers, heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't what I had feared. Ryan hadn't fathered a hidden child. But the results revealed something far more significant. A man named Daniel Whitman was my father's son from a previous relationship. My half-brother, he had lived quietly in Vermont for decades, unaware of any claim to the estate. But his existence now created a legal variable that Ryan hadn't anticipated. I reread the report multiple times, my mind spinning. Daniel's legitimacy meant that if his claim were recognized, the temporary control Ryan had secured over Whitman Ridge could be challenged. The transfer papers I had signed so innocently suddenly felt like a fragile facade, easily dismantled with the right evidence. My pulse quickened as I realized that this revelation could shift the balance of power entirely, and that Ryan's confidence might be his undoing. My phone buzzed. A message from Daniel appeared. "We need to talk. It's about your father's will, and your husband doesn't know I exist." My fingers tightened around the device. One envelope, one message, and the entire strategy Ryan thought was foolproof could collapse. I felt a surge of anticipation and apprehension. Daniel wasn't a threat, he was a potential ally, a key piece in reclaiming what was mine. I contacted my lawyer immediately, laying out every detail. The DNA results, Ryan's secret financial arrangements with the Vermont startup, and the signed transfer documents. My lawyer's eyes widened as he examined the evidence. "Claire," he said carefully, "if Daniel's claim is recognized, it could void the transfer and put the estate temporarily under court supervision. The implications for your husband's control are significant." I spent the morning cross-referencing Daniel's potential claim with my father's will and financial records. Every detail mattered. Dates, signatures, and correspondence could support his legitimacy and strengthen our position. I realized that this wasn't just about uncovering secrets. It was about creating a legal shield to protect Whitman Ridge from Ryan's manipulations. The estate's future rested on precise, deliberate action, and Daniel's existence had given me a crucial advantage. By afternoon, I arranged a meeting with Daniel at a small vineyard he owned near Vermont. Driving through winding country roads, I reflected on how unpredictable alliances had reshaped the landscape. Daniel revealed that Ryan had attempted to approach him a year earlier, offering incentives to waive any potential claim if the DNA test ever surfaced. Daniel had refused and waited for the right time. Now, with me fully aware and prepared, we had an opportunity to counter Ryan's takeover strategy. We sat together, laying out a plan. I would maintain the appearance of compliance with Ryan while gathering further evidence. Daniel would verify his legal standing and prepare for any probate challenges. Together, we could highlight Ryan's undisclosed obligations and misrepresentations to investors, introducing doubt into his supposedly flawless plan. Each email, ledger entry, and bank document became a potential lever. Ryan believed he controlled every variable, but we now held the unseen cards. As we concluded our meeting, I felt a mixture of relief and focus. Daniel's involvement transformed the situation from a personal struggle into a calculated strategy. The DNA test had shifted the battlefield, and now the estate was protected by knowledge. Preparation, and the unexpected alliance I had never anticipated. Driving back to Whitman Ridge as the sun dipped low, I walked among the vines, thinking about my father's lessons and the legacy he had entrusted to me. Every vine, every barrel, every label carried decades of care and integrity. Ryan had underestimated me and misjudged the value of knowledge, patience, and strategic thinking. That night, I organized the documents we had gathered, reviewing the emails, transfer papers, and financial records once more. Each piece reinforced our case and exposed the cracks in Ryan's plan. The estate's security depended not on confrontation, but on precision, preparation, and timing. The DNA revelation had been the catalyst, turning uncertainty into opportunity, and Daniel's guidance had turned potential chaos into strategy. As I lay in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling, thinking about the challenge ahead. The next morning, the first steps of our coordinated plan would begin. Whitman Ridge was no longer just a vineyard, it had become a chessboard, and I was ready to move the first pieces. One envelope, one DNA test, and a careful strategy had changed everything. And the game was just beginning. I arrived at the old Whitman barn at dawn, the morning fog curling over the Finger Lakes like a silent warning. Daniel Whitman was already there, standing tall among the dust-covered barrels, his calm presence contrasting sharply with the tension that had gripped me for weeks. He didn't need introductions. The DNA test and the emails we had collected had already told the story. "I'm not here to claim the estate," Daniel said quietly, his voice firm. "I just want to make sure it stays in the right hands." Relief and cautious optimism surged through me. Daniel wasn't a threat. He was a potential ally against Ryan. My pulse quickened as I realized that together, we could challenge Ryan's takeover in a way he hadn't anticipated. He slid a folder across the wooden table, thick with documents and emails. "These are the correspondences and agreements Ryan tried to keep hidden. If we use them correctly, we can expose everything he's been doing, but one wrong move could tie the estate up in legal battles for months." We spent the next few hours meticulously reviewing every piece of evidence. The signed transfer documents, the emails with Vermont investors, and the financial statements showing collateral tied to Whitman Ridge. Each detail revealed Ryan's overconfidence and the cracks in his supposedly flawless plan. Daniel explained that Ryan had approached him a year ago, offering incentives to waive any potential claim if the DNA test ever surfaced. Daniel had refused, waiting for the right moment. Now, with the results confirmed and me prepared to act, our combined knowledge could neutralize Ryan's schemes. We mapped out a strategy. I would maintain the appearance of compliance while quietly gathering additional evidence. Daniel would verify his legal standing and prepare for any probate or inheritance challenges. And together, we would ensure that the investors and the bank understood the full scope of Ryan's undisclosed financial maneuvers. Timing was critical. One misstep could allow Ryan to regain leverage. Returning to the estate, I watched Ryan from a distance. He continued his routine, unaware that Daniel and I were coordinating a counter-strategy. Each confident move he made, every phone call he took, became a potential misstep that could be used strategically. I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. Ryan had assumed he controlled every angle, but we were turning the tables. That evening, a longtime employee slipped a note under my office door, alerting me to ledger discrepancies Ryan had attempted to cover up. The small tip confirmed what Daniel and I already suspected. Ryan's control was built on deception, and the more we uncovered, the more unstable his plan became. I walked through the vineyard at sunset, reflecting on the journey so far. Ryan's charm and confidence had made me doubt myself. But the DNA results, Daniel's presence, and the employee's tip revealed the truth. Knowledge, strategy, and alliances were far more powerful than fear or confrontation. Daniel's unexpected involvement had highlighted a critical lesson. Power didn't come from intimidation, it came from understanding, planning, and timing. Late that night, my phone buzzed. Daniel's message read, "Investors want a written statement about Ryan's disclosures. Timing is everything." My stomach tightened as I realized the next moves we made would determine whether Whitman Ridge remained safe or fell into chaos. I reviewed all the documents again, ensuring nothing was overlooked. Emails, financial statements, and notarized records formed a chain of evidence that could dismantle Ryan's facade. Every detail mattered. The stakes had never been higher. Whitman Ridge wasn't just a vineyard anymore, it was a battlefield. And Daniel and I were finally aligned. As I prepared for the investor correspondence the following morning, I felt a mixture of resolve and anticipation. Ryan believed he had control, but he hadn't accounted for the combination of evidence, legal leverage, and strategic alliances that now stood against him. The estate stretched out before me, rows of vines glowing under the moonlight. One envelope, one ally, and a carefully planned strategy had shifted the game completely. Ryan's overconfidence had given us the advantage, and I knew that with patience, precision, and the right timing, Whitman Ridge could be secured. The next day would be critical, the first real test of our plan to protect the vineyard, reclaim the legacy, and expose the deception that had threatened everything my family had built. The next morning, I arrived at Whitman Ridge Estate to find Ryan in full control mode, moving quickly from office to vineyard, reviewing spreadsheets, and speaking sharply to the harvest crew. His confidence was still there, but I noticed a tension beneath it, glances at my office, hurried phone calls, a slight edge in his voice. He was accelerating his plans, pushing to finalize a majority stake transfer to a Chicago investor group. The stakes had never felt higher, and I knew the moment to act was approaching. I gathered the folder Daniel and I had compiled, the signed transfer documents, the emails with the Vermont startup investors, and the financial statements showing undisclosed collateral tied to Whitman Ridge. Everything pointed to a single truth. Ryan had built his takeover on deception, and now the DNA test and Daniel's legal standing gave us leverage he could not anticipate. Daniel called quietly on my phone, walking me through the strategy one last time. "Claire, timing is everything. We need to make sure the investors see the risk without revealing all our cards. Ryan believes he's in control, but we can pause the deal long enough for the legal process to intervene." The Chicago investors were on the line within the hour. I subtly referenced the collateral tied to the Vermont startup without naming Ryan directly, phrasing it as a clarification about financial risk in the estate. The investors responded immediately with questions, requesting verification from independent sources. Each hesitation and pointed inquiry planted doubt, and I could feel the tension in the room rise as Ryan tried to maintain his composure. For the first time in months, I saw a flicker of panic in Ryan's eyes. He realized that the alliance between Daniel and me, combined with the evidence we had gathered, had undermined his carefully orchestrated plan. The pause we created in the investor's decision gave us the upper hand, exposing the cracks in his strategy while keeping our own moves concealed. Later that afternoon, I reviewed the situation with Daniel. The investor group had delayed their decision, citing concerns about undisclosed liabilities and pending legal questions. Ryan's control, which had seemed absolute just days before, was now precarious. The documents, emails, and financial records we had compiled formed a network of evidence that could shield the estate and provide leverage to prevent further unilateral action by Ryan. I walked through the vineyard as the sun dipped lower, the golden light glinting across the vines. Each barrel, each row of grapes reminded me of the decades of care my father had invested in Whitman Ridge. This was more than a business, it was a legacy, and I understood that patience, knowledge, and strategy were far more powerful than confrontation or anger. That evening, Ryan tried to rally confidence in a late-night video call with the investors. But the pause and uncertainty we had introduced could not be ignored. His arguments felt hollow, and I watched as the tension among the investors grew. Each raised question, each request for clarification, chipped away at the illusion of control he had built. A thinly veiled threat arrived later that night from Ryan's lawyer, suggesting that any interference on our part could be framed as obstruction. I took a deep breath, knowing that the next moves had to be precise and legally bulletproof. Every detail, every decision, every message now had consequences that could tip the balance either way. I reviewed the folder one last time before bed, ensuring that every piece of evidence was organized and ready for any eventuality. Emails, ledgers, financial records, and Daniel's verified legal standing were all tools in a careful strategy to protect the estate. Whitman Ridge had survived decades of challenges, and now it would survive this battle too, not through force, but through meticulous planning and precision. As the night grew still, I walked through the rows of vines under the moonlight, feeling the weight of responsibility and the surge of cautious triumph. Ryan had underestimated me, misjudged Daniel, and failed to account for the combined power of knowledge, preparation, and strategic alliances. The estate was no longer just a vineyard, it was a battlefield, and the first significant advantage had shifted to our side. The next day would determine whether Whitman Ridge remained secure or whether Ryan would attempt another move to reclaim control. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and faint coffee, charged with a tension that made every movement feel amplified. I sat upright, documents stacked neatly before me, as Ryan entered with his lawyer, projecting confidence that felt hollow in the face of the evidence we had prepared. The DNA results, Daniel's verified legal status as a hidden heir, and the financial disclosures we had compiled hovered over him like a storm cloud he could not escape. "Your Honor," Ryan began smoothly, "the transfer of Whitman Ridge Estate was fully compliant and necessary to maintain investor confidence." I took a deep breath, feeling every nerve alert. This was the moment that would determine everything, whether Ryan's carefully orchestrated plan would collapse or survive. Our strategy had brought months of evidence and careful planning into one decisive moment. The judge leaned forward, eyes sharp, and asked, "Are there any undisclosed obligations or potential claims we should be aware of?" The question cut through the room like a spotlight, exposing Ryan's overconfidence. Ryan's lawyer attempted to spin the narrative, claiming I had been hesitant and unstable, trying to discredit our challenge. But Daniel stepped forward, calm and authoritative, providing notarized documentation, verifying his legal status and the legitimacy of our concerns. Every piece of evidence was laid bare. Emails showing Ryan's hidden agreements with Vermont investors, bank statements revealing undisclosed collateral tied to the estate, and signed transfer documents executed under misleading pretenses. I felt a surge of clarity as the courtroom absorbed the evidence. This wasn't about personal vengeance. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully mine and honoring the legacy my father had built. Every barrel, every vine, every bottle label represented decades of care, integrity, and trust. Ryan had underestimated me, and his miscalculations were now exposed. As my lawyer walked the judge through the timeline of Ryan's deception, I watched Ryan's composure falter in subtle ways, a twitch in his jaw, a flicker of panic in his eyes. The courtroom murmured softly, the weight of the evidence shifting the perception of authority. Each email, ledger, and bank record demonstrated that Ryan had built his control on omissions and half-truths. I presented the final piece of the puzzle, Daniel's legal verification and the confirmation of his inheritance rights. The judge examined the documents closely, nodding and scribbling notes. I realized that the combination of careful strategy, solid evidence, and the unexpected alliance with Daniel had placed us in a position of undeniable strength. Finally, the judge spoke, after reviewing the evidence, including undisclosed financial arrangements and the verified status of a potential heir. The transfer of controlling interest in Whitman Ridge Estate is hereby declared null and void. The estate remains under the ownership of Claire Whitman, and any further transactions require full disclosure and consent of all legal parties involved. The words struck like thunder. Ryan sat frozen, his confident mask replaced by disbelief and panic. Investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Realizing the implications of the ruling, Daniel and I exchanged a quiet glance, relief and cautious triumph passing between us. Ryan whispered something to his lawyer, his voice tight and low, but the judge's gavel cut through like a declaration. Court adjourned. The tension in the room slowly eased, replaced by a sense of finality. Whitman Ridge was back under my control, its legacy intact. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and quiet victory. The months of preparation, the evidence we had gathered, and Daniel's involvement had ensured that the estate remained safe. Ryan had been exposed, and the legal system had validated our challenge. Even as I left the courthouse, I knew the battle wasn't entirely over. Ryan would not disappear quietly, and somewhere, a countermove was likely brewing. But for the first time in months, I felt confident that Whitman Ridge would remain protected. The lessons of strategy, patience, and vigilance had been tested and proven. The sun was setting over the Finger Lakes as I stepped outside. Whitman Ridge stretched out in front of me, rows of vines glowing in the golden light. One chapter had closed, and another, grounded in security and renewed control, was beginning. The estate was mine to protect, and the future, finally, felt within reach. The morning sun spilled over Whitman Ridge Estate, casting long golden shadows across the rows of vines. I walked slowly along the familiar paths, letting the crisp autumn air fill my lungs. The tension that had gripped me for months was gone, replaced by a quiet clarity. Whitman Ridge was back under my control. Every barrel, every label, every row of grapes carried the Whitman name and my father's legacy. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe without the weight of deception pressing down. Daniel was at the estate, helping with the harvest schedule, his calm presence a reminder that alliances could be powerful without ego. Ryan had retreated, facing the consequences of his manipulation and hidden financial arrangements. Investors had stepped back, and the court had officially nullified the transfer papers. Whitman Ridge was safe, its operations intact, and the legacy my father had built could continue without interference. I paused near the tasting room, letting the wind carry the faint scent of crushed grapes and oak barrels. Memories of my father flooded my mind, his hands guiding mine through the crush, his laughter filling the cellar, his advice about diligence and vigilance echoing through every corridor of the estate. He had always said, "Claire, this land isn't just soil, it's a story. Protect it with everything you have." I understood now that protecting the estate wasn't about confrontation or revenge. It was about knowledge, strategy, and patience. The vineyard stretched endlessly before me, the sunlight reflecting off the dew on the vines. Ryan's overconfidence had been his undoing, but it wasn't his downfall that mattered. The true victory was preserving what my father had built and reclaiming control of Whitman Ridge with integrity. Daniel had been an unexpected ally, his quiet strength and legal insight turning a potential crisis into a path for recovery. Later that afternoon, Daniel and I reviewed every detail of the estate's operations, making sure all investor agreements, bank loans, and financial records were transparent and properly documented. The lessons of the past months were clear. Vigilance, careful observation, and deliberate action were far more powerful than anger or retaliation. Whitman Ridge had survived deception because we had acted strategically, relying on evidence and thoughtful planning rather than impulsive emotion. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, I walked among the golden rows of Riesling and ice wine vines. Each vine represented decades of labor, trust, and family pride. I realized that the DNA test, the unexpected alliance, and the court's validation were tools that allowed me to protect the estate, not weapons of revenge. Strategy, knowledge, and careful planning had preserved everything my father had entrusted to me. I paused by the barrels, my fingers brushing the labels proudly bearing the Whitman name. One envelope, one revelation, and countless hours of preparation had changed everything. Ryan's manipulation had been exposed, but the real lesson lay in understanding power and timing, in reclaiming control without compromising integrity. The estate stood as a testament not to conflict, but to diligence and careful stewardship. As evening fell, I thought about the viewers who would watch this story unfold. For anyone who has ever faced deception, betrayal, or the threat of losing something precious, the lesson is clear. Knowledge and strategy are more powerful than fear or anger. Protecting what matters requires vigilance, preparation, and the courage to act when the time is right. I turned to Daniel as we walked along the vineyard path, the golden light fading behind us. "It's more than just a vineyard," I said softly. "It's a legacy. And now we can make sure it's safe for the future." He nodded, his calm presence reinforcing the truth of my words. Whitman Ridge was secure, and I had reclaimed control not by confrontation, but by understanding, preparation, and strategic alliances. The vineyard would continue to thrive, carrying the Whitman name proudly into the next generation. As I closed the doors to the estate office and stepped out into the cool night air, I felt a sense of satisfaction and resolve. Ryan would not interfere again, and the legacy of Whitman Ridge would remain protected. Every decision, every carefully timed move, had brought us to this moment. The vineyard, the family name, and my inheritance were safe. Now, I turn to you, the viewers. Have you ever had to stand up for what was rightfully yours? Have you faced deception or betrayal and had to reclaim control of your life or your legacy? Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your stories, your strategies, and your lessons. If this story inspired you, remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories of family drama, hidden secrets, and strategic triumphs waiting. Each one a reminder that careful planning and integrity can overcome manipulation. One envelope, one revelation, and a series of deliberate actions had changed everything, but the true power lay in vigilance, knowledge, and the courage to protect what you love. Whitman Ridge stands tall, and so do I. The estate is safe, the family name intact, and the story continues, not with chaos, but with strategy, clarity, and resilience.